When you cross over the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the people living there. Caleb stood in front of the tribe of Judah, listening to Moses give the Lord's instructions. This should be a day of exaltation, but he felt weighed down. 40 years had passed. The wandering was over, and he was an 80-year-old man. But it was not the years that burdened him. It was the responsibility for these people. You must destroy all their carved and molten images and demolish all their pagan shrines, Moses' voice carried. Take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given it to you to occupy. You must distribute the land among the clans. Caleb had been placed in charge of all of Judah. If you fail to drive out the people who live in the land, those who remain will be like splinters in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land where you live, and then the Lord will do to you what he plans to do to them. Time passed quickly as Moses reminded them of the plagues of Egypt and their own sins. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commandments I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you're away on a journey, when you are lying down and when you're getting up again. They are life to you. Make no treaties with the people of the land and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Moses spread his hands as though he would embrace them all. I am now 120 years old. I am no longer able to lead you. The Lord has told me that I will not cross the Jordan River. The people wailed and cried out in protest. Caleb clenched his teeth. Tears spilled into his beard. His throat was tight and on fire. He looked at Joshua standing tall beside Moses, his face set. Moses raised his voice as though it came from the voice of God. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. The people grew quiet again, grieving yet obedient. The Lord will destroy the nations living there, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua is your new leader, and he will go with you, just as the Lord promised. Eleazar, the high priest, anointed Joshua, after which Moses laid hands upon him and commissioned him to carry out the Lord's commands. Then, raising his hands to the cloud overshadowing them, Moses sang Israel's history. He sang blessings upon them, and then he dismissed the congregation. He's gone. Joshua's voice was thick, fear glistening in his eyes. Gone where? Up Mount Nebo, Joshua wept like a boy who had lost his father. Caleb could not give in to tears, not if he was to be of any help to Joshua. He will see the whole of the land God is giving us from there. He will see from Gilead to the Negev, from the Jordan Valley to Jericho, so far as Zoar. I had hoped. We assumed Moses would be there, Joshua, but we didn't understand that you and I would be the only men from our generation to enter Canaan. There will never be another prophet like Moses. No man will ever do the miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, until the one Moses said they would come, and one who would fulfill the law. But Caleb knew what lay beneath Joshua's words. The Lord had appointed you to lead his people, and lead you shall. Joshua put his hands over his head as though to hide from God. I tremble at the thought. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, my friend. Caleb sat down beside him. When our time of grieving is over, God will tell you what to do, and whatever it is, I will stand with you. Caleb spent most of the day at the tabernacle, close to Joshua, who was closeted in prayer. Lord, help him. Be with him as you were with Moses. Tell him what he needs to know to lead us into our inheritance. They ate together in silence, pondering the days ahead, uncertain of how to proceed, where to start. For once, Caleb did not press his friend. He waited, knowing the day would come when the Lord would speak to Joshua as he had spoken to Moses. Joshua rose and stood at the entrance of his tent. He stared out at Jericho, looming over on the other side of the Jordan, immense, fortified, a closed gate into Canaan. Bring me 2 good men, Caleb. He spoke with the assurance Caleb had not heard before. The Lord had spoken to him. Men, other than your own sons, I'm sending them in to look over the land, especially Jericho. Done. When the young men had left on their errand, Caleb tilted his head. What else did the Lord say to you? Be strong and courageous, Joshua smiled grimly. He said that many times. We all need to hear it. No man was eager to be in the middle of a bloodbath. We must be very careful to obey all the laws Moses gave us, Caleb. We must follow everything the Lord said. Caleb knew Joshua meditated on the law day and night. Anything else? The Lord promised to be with me wherever I go. Caleb's spirit rose like an eagle, wings spread. Where you are, there I shall be. I need to speak with all the officers. Caleb sent messages and the men came quickly, ready to do whatever Joshua told them. Tell the people to get their supplies ready. The Lord has said that in 3 days from now, he pointed to a spot on the map Moses had prepared, we cross the Jordan here. We will take possession of the land the Lord has given, our God has given us. Even the Reubenites and Gadites who had asked to remain on the east side of the Jordan prepared to go in and fight with their brothers. Whatever you have commanded us, we will do, Joshua. Wherever you send us, we will go. Everyone worked and prepared with practiced precision. The years in the wilderness of watching the cloud rise up, move, and settle had trained these people to move quickly when so commanded. The defeat of the kings Sihon and Og encouraged them. Balak, king of Moab, had withdrawn now that Balaam and the 5 kings of Midian who had listened to his counsel were dead. Israel stood ready, eager to obey the Lord's command to take the land. The spies returned with good news. The Lord will certainly give us the whole land. Rahab told us the heart of every man in Jericho is terrified of us. Who's Rahab? A prostitute. She had brought them into her house and made them swear by the Lord God that they would save her and her family from the coming destruction. Caleb's heart sank. Already, compromise. And then he thought of his 2 concubines and prayed, let this woman Rahab worship and adore you, Lord, as Micah and Ephah have. She protected us from the king's men and told us the way of escape. We might not have made it out alive without her. Joshua asked no further questions. Then you will see that you keep the vow you made in the name of the Lord. Gather the people tomorrow morning. I will give them the Lord's instructions. As the men filed out of the tent, Caleb remained behind in case Joshua wanted to discuss plans and go over maps again. Joshua sat and beckoned him to do likewise. We will cross the Jordan in 2 days. I didn't want to say anything to the officers. Not yet. Caleb didn't have to ask why. The river was at flood stage, and no one in Israel knew how to swim or build rafts or a bridge. I'm sure the Lord told you where to get across. No, he didn't. He only said the priests are to carry the ark and the people are to follow 1,000 feet behind. Feeling a quiver of alarm, Caleb wondered what they would do once they reached the floodwaters, and then he remembered and laughed. Do not be afraid, my friend. Do not be discouraged, he grinned. A river is but a small matter to God who opened the sea. Gather around, Caleb beckoned his sons and their wives and their children. They came eagerly. Ephah and Maach were among his family members now, grafted in, warmly accepted, and held accountable to God. He told all of them of Egypt and slavery and how the Lord had sent Moses to deliver. He told them of the plagues upon Egypt and about the miracles of protection God provided for his people. You have heard your history from Moses' own lips, and you have heard it from mine as well. And so you will hear it often for as long as I live. And you must tell your children and your grandchildren so they will not forget. Caleb reminded them of the sins committed that had brought God's judgment upon his generation. Sin crouches like a lion waiting to devour you. You must resist it. You must obey the Lord. Do whatever he asks of you, no matter how difficult. He reminded them of the sins that had cost the lives of 24,000. Your sins bring death to those you love. You must keep your eye upon the Lord, not just tomorrow or until we've been taken into the land God has promised us, but always serve the Lord with gladness. Stand in his presence with thanksgiving. Our hope and our future are in him. His sons leaned closer, eyes ablaze, tense. They had spent their lives preparing for the day at hand. Tomorrow, you will hear the word of the Lord from his anointed. Joshua will tell us what we are to do. Obey him as you would obey the Lord. And thus they did. The people consecrated themselves. They waited until the priests carrying the ark were 1,000 feet ahead of them and then followed. When the priest came to the Jordan River, they stepped down into it. A sound of wind came and the water rolled back, leaving dry land where water had rushed. The priests stood in the middle of the empty riverbed, holding the ark as men, women, children, over 1 million of them, crossed over. When the entire nation stood on the west bank of the Jordan, Joshua sent one man from each of the 12 tribes back, each one for a river stone. He stacked them there at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. In the future, your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them, this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the river right before your eyes, and he kept it dry until you were all across, just as he did at the Red Sea, when he dried it up until we had all crossed over. He did this so that all the nations of earth might know the power of the Lord, and that you might fear the Lord your God forever. Joshua cannot have heard right, Father. The Lord commanded that we all be circumcised, and so we shall. I'm ashamed I didn't think to do it years ago when you were boys. No one has to be circumcised, not in 40 years. We should wait. Wait, Caleb glowered at his sons. When God gives a command, we obey. We don't wait. Be reasonable, Father. We're camped within sight of Jericho. If we submit to this mutilation now, we won't be able to defend ourselves. Mutilation? You call the sign of the covenant between God and us mutilation? He watched the color drain from his son's face. I spoke rashly. Forgive me. It's God's forgiveness you need. He fixed his eyes on each of his sons and grandsons. Are you afraid of a small knife in the hands of a priest? They all shook their heads, denying any fear. Shobab laughed self-deprecatingly. Yes, I'm afraid. As am I, Caleb said. You? Let it be a comfort to know that your father will be in line for circumcision tomorrow. They all began talking at once. His words had not served to calm them, but caused even more agitation. Father, Shobab said feebly, Misha's right. What is to keep the Canaanite warriors from coming out of Jericho and slaughtering us while we mend? God has been with us every day, and you can ask such a question? Restraining his anger, Caleb spoke slowly, quietly, emphatically. The Lord is our shield and strength. He will watch over and protect us. We have nothing to fear. When the circumcisions were completed, Caleb retired to his tent. Racked with pain, he lay on his pallet. When fever came upon him, he couldn't sleep. And now that they had crossed the Jordan, the manna had stopped raining from heaven. His concubines, Ephah and Ma'ach, knew how to prepare meals from the provisions of the land offered, but Caleb missed the manna. Gone was the sweetness God had given them. Joshua came to see him. Don't get up, Caleb. Drained by the fever, Caleb remained upon his cushioned pallet. He chuckled bleakly. You are blessed among men. Joshua had been circumcised as a baby. Few among the Jews had continued the practice once they were enslaved by the Egyptians. How are the others faring? Better than you, old friend. Caleb grasped Joshua's extended hand and pulled himself up. Youth has its advantages. Wincing, he waved Maacah away, and walked slowly, tenderly, outside. It was the first time in 3 days he'd been outside his tent. He squinted at the bright sunlight. The Lord has given you his plan. When and how do we take Jericho? Tomorrow at daybreak, Joshua told him God's plan. Astounded, Caleb went over the plan again. We are to be silent? Yes. No war cry. No one is to speak. And then we march around the city, nothing more. For 6 days, the ark will go before us, followed by 7 priests carrying shofars. On the 7th day, they will blow them, and we will shout as we march around the city 7 times. Caleb looked at the walls of Jericho. Not since leaving Egypt had he seen such a well-fortified city. And God said the walls will collapse? Yes. The plan was preposterous. It was ridiculous. No man in his right mind would have ever thought up such a thing. Caleb laughed in praise. All the world will hear of this. People will talk about what God did at Jericho for thousands of years to come. Then you believe it will happen? Of course I believe it, Caleb's laughter died. You don't? Yes, I believe, but will the men? Caleb understood Joshua's trepidation. It had not been long ago when some of them had gone after other gods at Peor. 24,000 had died during the plague God sent to discipline them. They'd better. From the time of the Garden of Eden, the seed of rebellion had been planted deep in the hearts of men. It was there, a real battle raged. On the first day of marching, Caleb concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. He throbbed with pain and gritted his teeth, determined to make it around the city and back to his tent with his head high. On the second day, he moved less stiffly and noticed the soldiers on Jericho's battlements staring out. On the third day, some mocked. By the 5th day, men and women were laughing and shouting blasphemies from the wall. Even children had joined in. His sons and grandsons did not speak when they returned to camp, but their wrath showed in the way they yanked off their belts and swords. Caleb watched them, smiling secretly, thanking God. The days of suffering from the circumcision were over. Each day renewed and built their strength, and each day the Canaanites added fuel to the fire that would consume them. Let it build. Hold that anger in. Hold it in until the last day, the day of the Lord. When the 7th day came, Caleb was at full strength, his blood on fire. The men no longer marched with quiet reserve. They pounded their feet into the ground. Boom, boom, boom. Each time around the city, the tension grew. The men on the walls of Jericho stopped laughing. 7 times the army of Israel marched around the city, shofars blowing, and then they stopped and turned inward. The blast came long and loud. Caleb's heart rattled, his blood raced, the air of retribution filled his lungs. He released it with a mighty shout, "For the Lord!" Thousands joined in until the sound was deafening, terrifying. God's promise was fulfilled before their eyes. The great walls of Jericho shook with the sounds of the shofars and their battle cries, and as the walls shook and cracked, the Israelites shouted all the louder for the Lord. The walls collapsed and rampart soldiers tumbling, dust rising with the screams. Raising his sword, Caleb ran with Joshua, and like a tidal wave, thousands upon thousands came with them, sweeping across the plain straight for the city. The sword in his hand had once been a scythe, and he swung it to the right and left, cutting down Israelites like stalks of wheat. Men, women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys, nothing that breathed survived. Panting, Caleb stood in the center of the vanquished city. "Remember your orders. All of the silver, gold, bronze, and iron are sacred to the Lord and must be taken to his treasury. Destroy the rest, burn the city, burn everything in it." And that's the end of part 1.